Hi everyone. We're going to do a video on the origins of the Dead Sea Scrolls transformation. In other words, they were for 40 years just being suppressed about what they were really about. Baigent does a good job of summarizing what's been going on. There's something wrong. The Catholic authorities that are involved in the what's called the international theme, are really serving the Catholic Church. For some reason, they're afraid of something in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They don't want anybody else to look at them. They're guarding them. They won't let them out of their hands. And Eisenman behind the scenes is grabbing them and translating from plates, photo plates from the I think it was the Rockefeller Foundation he got them from. And so now in the next year, 92, we're going to see a major revelation where we're going to actually see something is being exposed about the early Christian church, the Ebion, and their battle between the Zaddik, James the Justice, who Eisenman identifies him as, and someone called the Spouter of Lies. And you can just imagine who that is, okay, and who Eisenman thinks that is. So anyway, but believe it or not, we are still 40 now from 1992. That's almost 30 years ago. Yeah, we're at 2022. Yeah, so that's 30 years ago. We've moved. So we had 40 years of being suppressed deliberately by the international team, and now we've had 30 more years where they just ignore Professor Eisenman, and they don't give it any credit, and they act like he never said anything, and they don't tell you the full story. And you can go to all the seminars at church and do all the Dead Sea Scrolls history, and they'll never tell you we found the Ebion writings, we found the early church, the conflict between James the Just and Paul. And what really seems to have happened was those 40 years saturated into the consciousness that there was nothing relevant about Christianity in the scrolls, and it's really been a battle for Professor Eisenman. I am hoping that we will create a vanguard of people who have an awareness about this, and will take the drama that I'm going to show here today as sort of an inspiration to realize how close we came to having none of this, and how it was so fought against for 40 years. So we have to overcome 40 years of propaganda coming out of the international team running the Dead Sea Scrolls to get past this. Now we've had 30 years of ignoring Professor Eisenman. We need to now to promote and advance. He's an absolute A-class scholar. So there's no question that he has the ability and the mental fortitude and the correctness of all his statements, all his opinions about what these figures fit in history. Who was the Zaddik? Who was the Spouter of Lies? Why were they debating about the justification by works? Why were they discussing Habakkuk 2 verse 4 about is it faith alone or is it faith plus works? I mean, it's the whole thing of the early Christian church. It's all there in the original these works. It can't be anybody but our original church, and it's named after. It has the same name as our original church, which everybody knows independently were the Ebion. This was the church of. Even Jerome said in his commentary in Galatians, he said that Paul, when he said, remember the poor at Jerusalem, Paul knew that meant the early church being the Ebion. Poor means Ebion. So anyway, long story short, we're going to get going, launching, and we're going to start with the Baigent book, and at the end, we're going to get into what you would have experienced. This is almost like going to happen in real time, just accelerated. Where you're going to then see here's what happens in 92 with Eisenman, and then we're going to have somebody summarize his book, and you'll see all of the major advances that are happening just right after Baigent basically predicts there's something wrong here. We need to have exposure. Could it be the church has been hiding this now for 40 years? And that's exactly what was going on. All right. Okay, so enjoy. Okay, this is Michael Baigent, and he brings out some evidence in this initially, so he has some evidence to understand what it was all about, and he's going to throw out theories of what was the purpose of keeping the scrolls down and not disclosing them, and some of them have been summarized and translated, over since 47. By 1991, they were mostly hidden away and being interpreted by people who were claiming exclusive right of control and a very limited small group hanging around a particular priest. And we'll get into that. But he is going to conjecture that he believes it could largely be a group called the Ebion, and he doesn't even know what that means, or the poor. So he is a what you would call a documentarian, a newsman, not a particular. I mean, he had religious background in his family, but he's just basically been a TV producer, writer, and that kind of thing. So but he's good. He's good. He thinks through things. So this was a book he wrote, The Dead Sea Scrolls, Deception. And anyway, so now let's go read it. And he by the way died in 2013, and he was known for questioning traditional perceptions of history and the life of Jesus. Now we're going to learn something about what some people call traditional perceptions of history, as people who can see through the crap that's that's going on, and call a spade after years of what was going on, the suppression of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, and so now we'll begin reading his book, beginning at page 129, chapters entitled The Dilemma for Christian Orthodoxy. There is virtually unanimous agreement among all the concerned parties, apart of course from the international team themselves and the École Biblique, and he means these are the controlling people, the international team is so-called, that the history of Dead Sea Scroll scholarship does constitute a scandal, and there would seem to be little doubt that something irregular, illicit, perhaps, but without moral or academic sanction, lurks behind the delays, the procrastinations, the equivocation, the restrictions on material. Continuing on page 129. The stakes would be high, however, in any sphere where a lack of reliable first-hand testimony had to be redressed by historical and archaeological research. They would be high if, for example, a corpus of documents pertaining to Arthurian Britain were suddenly to come to light. But would there be the same suppression of material as there is in connection with the Dead Sea Scrolls? And would one find looming as a supreme arbiter in the background the shadowy presence of an ecclesiastical institution such as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith? The Nag Hammadi scrolls are a case in point. Certainly they afforded ample opportunity for venal motives. Next page, page 130, to come into play. And he's talking about some other ancient scrolls that were found, I think it's in Egypt, and they easily came to light quickly. There was no motive to suppress it, is what he's saying. Such motives to one or another degree may indeed have done so, but the church had no opportunity to establish control over the texts found at Nag Hammadi. So he's saying even if they had a motive, they had no opportunity to do anything about it. And venal motives, notwithstanding, the entire corpus of Nag Hammadi material found its way quickly into print and public domain. Okay, continuing with page 130. The Church's high-level involvement in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship must inevitably foster a grave element of suspicion. Can one ignore the possibility of a causal connection between that involvement and the shambles the Qumran research has become? One is compelled to ask, as indeed many informed outsiders have, whether some other vested interest may be at stake, a vested interest larger than the reputation of individual scholars, the vested interest of Christianity as a whole, for example, and of Christian doctrine, at least as propounded by the Church and its traditions. Ever since the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered, one single, all-pervasive question has haunted the imagination, generating excitement, anxiety, and perhaps dread. Might these texts, issuing from so close to the source, and unlike the New Testament, never having been edited or tampered with, shed some significant new light on the origins of Christianity, on the so-called early church in Jerusalem, and perhaps on Jesus himself? Might they contain something compromising, something that challenges, possibly even refutes, established traditions? Continuing on page 130. Certainly, official interpretation ensured that they did not. There is, of course, nothing to suggest any deliberate or systematic falsification of evidence on the part of the international team, but for Father DeVoe, his most intensely personal convictions were deeply engaged and were bound to have exerted some influence. Continuing on page 130. The evidence can be interpreted in a number of plausible ways, some of which are less compromising to Christendom than others. It is hardly surprising in the circumstances that DeVoe should have inclined towards and promulgated the less compromising interpretations. Thus, while it was never stated explicitly, a necessity prevailed to read or interpret the evidence in accordance with certain governing principles. So far as possible, for example, the scrolls and their authors had to be kept as disassociated as possible from early Christianity, as depicted in the New Testament, and from the mainstream of first-century Judaism, whence early Christianity sprang. It was in adherence to such tenets that the orthodoxy of interpretation established itself, and a scholarly consensus originated. And he's talking about around the Dead Sea Scrolls. Thus, on page 131. Thus, the conclusions to which Father DeVal's team came in their interpretations of the scrolls conform to certain general tenets, the more important of which can be summarized as follows. 1. Now, these are what he's saying is this priest and this international team and all of these background influences from the Catholic Church were imposing itself on the conclusions that you were supposed to find. And these are the conclusions that were approved, essentially. The Qumran texts were seen as dating from long prior to the Christian era. That's number 1. Number 2, the scrolls were regarded as the work of a single reclusive community, an unorthodox sect on the periphery of Judaism, divorced from the epic's main currents of social, political, and, we'll go to the next slide, and religious thought. In particular, they were divorced from militant, revolutionary, and messianic nationalism as exemplified by the defenders of Masada. 3. The Qumran community must have been destroyed during the general uprising in Judea in AD 66 to 73, leaving all their documents behind, hidden for safety in nearby caves. 4. The beliefs of the Qumran community were presented as entirely different from Christianity and the teacher of righteousness, because he was not portrayed as divine, could not be equated with Jesus. Because he was not portrayed as divine, he could not be equated with Jesus. 5. Because John the Baptist was altogether too close to the teachings of the Qumran community, it was argued that he wasn't really Christian in any true sense of the word. He was merely a precursor. Okay, so now I'm going to read from page 133, but I want to make a comment that what he's talking about is these 5 tenets you had to basically follow were imposing themselves on the scholarship. But what's ironic is he doesn't see the most fundamental supposition, which is this community existed at Qumran. And that was the major fact that influenced these other 5 conclusions. So this group wasn't really from Qumran, and this idea of a community living in Qumran was also proven false, and this required other research. And this is where Golb, G-O-L-B, he did the research that proved, and with the Israeli antiquities experts, they concluded that there was no community at Qumran. It was a military fort, and the caves happened to be just nearby, and they just were used for preservation of the documents, and they obviously came from Jerusalem to avoid their being destroyed in the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The coins on the floor all date from 45 to 69 AD on the inside the caves, and there was a misinterpretation of the clay plates in that area as indicating there was a monastery there, and they must have been doing the copying of the books. Turned out there's no copy clips anywhere, and they would be definitely used to keep track of where you're copying from one text to another text. And the clay plates was explained when the antiquities group found out, oops, this is a clay plate factory using the wonderful clay out here in the middle of the desert to make clay plates. So that's actually, he himself doesn't realize he is already fixated on a certain assumption that the community was at Qumran, because that's another thing they were doing, making you think it's out here in the middle of nowhere, and making copies of books. Anyway, so that's not what was going on. Okay, so now he's going to talk about what is some of the evidence that people can detect from, and this is before all the documents have been revealed. So 92 is when we're going to get a whole boatload of new documents from Eisenman. He's the one breaking through the barrier and giving us documents that have been held in secret for decades, because he got copies, he got control uh, of the glass plates with the photographs, and he got that legally by dealing directly with I think it was the Rockefeller Foundation had been the ones who volunteered to pay for all that, and they had the legal right to give it to whoever they wanted. And I think they were going, hey, 40 years is enough. I mean, more than 40 years. Almost 50 years these things were strangled, and they gave it to Eisenman. He's the one who's publishing them now. Okay, anyway, so let's go to 133 in the top there. You see it's referencing Psalm 37:11. This is in one of the documents at the site, one of the documents that have been recovered. But the meek shall possess the land that delight themselves in abundant prosperity. The same psalm was of particular interest to the Qumran, and so he's talking about the Christians. We are interested in the meek shall inherit the earth, and so he quotes Psalm 37. He says the same psalm was of particular interest to the Qumran community. Now again, he's got that wrong assumption that this is a community living in Qumran. He's mistaken about that, but he's showing you the concept of the meek inheriting the earth is inside the documents at the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is a commentary on its meaning interpreted. It goes to the next page. This concerns the congregation of the poor, and now we're getting very close. It's the name Ebion, which was the original church, according to even Jerome. That was the name of the original church of Jerusalem, and that is Ebion in Hebrew translates to the word poor. This concerns the congregation of the poor, so that exactly equals, same thing. The congregation of the poor, or the meek, was one of the names by which the Qumran community, not Qumran community, remember, it's a community that's documents were copied by the priests back in Jerusalem to preserve them and keep them in the temple there until they had to be urgently removed for purposes of saving all the entire library of the temple was saved by sending it to Qumran. Okay, so the congregation of the poor was one of the names by which the community referred to themselves. Nor is this the only such parallel. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, preaches Jesus in Matthew 5, verse 3. The War Scroll from Cave 1 states, quote, among the poor in spirit there is power. Indeed, the whole of the Gospel of Matthew, and especially chapters 10 and 18, we'll go to the next slide, contains metaphors and terminology at times almost interchangeable with those of the community rule. That's a document found at Qumran. In Matthew 5, verse 48, for instance, Jesus stresses the concept of perfection. Quote, you must therefore be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect. The community rules speak of those who, quote, who walk in the way of perfection as commanded by God. There will be, the text affirms, quote, no pity on all who depart from the way, no comfort until their way becomes perfect. End of quote. In Matthew 21, verse 42, Jesus invokes Isaiah 28, verse 16, and echoes Psalm 118, verse 22. Quote, have you never read in the scriptures, it was the stone rejected by the builders that became the keystone. End of quote. The community rule from the Qumran discoveries invokes the same reference, stating that the counsel of the community shall be that tried wall, that precious cornerstone. All right, and now we're going to go take a look at another aspect of the records of the poor, and we're going to see there's a strong emphasis on the law over something against the law. This is page 135. Now this is 1991, and the key documents have not yet been released. Okay, so we just have to know that they're coming in a year, and I'm going to show you some of what they are at the end of this episode, but I want you to see the drama building up and what he is suspecting, what he is theorizing from the little scant evidence that was allowed to bleed through the hands of these clutching priests and people serving the Catholic Church. What was getting through is as much as we're going to see here. So in the above quote from his letter to Galatians, Paul ascribes no inordinate significance to the law. It's a nice way of putting it. He puts no emphasis on the law. In the Qumran text, however, the law is of paramount importance. The community rule begins, quote, the master shall teach the saints to live according to the book of the community rule, that they may seek God and do what is good and right before him, as he commanded by the hand of Moses and all his servants the prophets. Later, the community rule states that anyone who, quotes, transgresses one word of the law of Moses on any point whatever shall be expelled. This is very strict. and the law will endure, quote, for as long as the domain of Satan endures. Could be Christian. Seems a little more strict than Jesus might be, but that's, anyway. In his rigorous adherence to, but this is far different than Paul, right? In his rigorous adherence to the law, Jesus, strikingly enough, is much closer to the Qumran text than he is to Paul. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, verses 17 to 19, Jesus makes his position unequivocally clear, a position that Paul was subsequently to betray. It's interesting. This guy, Baigent, has no love for Christianity. He's just telling it the way it is when he's talking. And I just want to say that means objectively outsiders can see this conflict between Jesus and Paul, and you don't have to be a scholar. It's just right on the page. Okay, and he's going to quote Matthew 5, verses 17 to 19, and I'm going to correct down there at the bottom, and you'll see I put an arrow. The grammar has to include a change there slightly. Do not imagine that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to complete them. I tell you solemnly, not one dot, not one little stroke shall disappear from the law until its purpose is achieved. Therefore, the man who infringes even on one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be considered the least by those in the kingdom of heaven. It also goes on to say, and those who teach you the law would be called the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I think he should have included that. Okay, we've finished showing you the very, very small pieces of evidence I could see that I think are small that connects the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Ebion. There's something, and it's there, but you can't see the whole picture yet. We're going to see it. It's coming soon. But I did want to show you that the Catholic Church was officially re-emphasizing when it could that it was going to go along with this idea that the Essenes were there at the Dead Sea Scrolls. And remember, the Essenes are never mentioned there, and there's absolutely no evidence of the Essene community at all. And so just in passing, I want to show you there was a statement in the Last Supper that Jesus is doing something on a particular day, and it happens to mention the calendar. You can infer what calendar Jesus is following according, I think it's in the book of John. Are you following what's known, they now are calling the Qumran calendar, or the calendar that was being used in this particular group, in this text? Or would they following the rule that's kept at Jerusalem, which is somewhat different by a day? So the Catholic authorities are going to speak up and listen to what the Catholic authorities say. This text was sufficient to convince even Rome, according to Cardinal John Denelou, writing with a nihil obstat from the Vatican. So this is official stuff. Christ must have celebrated, and basing this on the Dead Sea Scrolls, Christ must have celebrated the Last Supper on the eve of Easter according to the Essenian calendar. That Essenian means Essene. So they're assuming that the calendar that was kept there at Qumran in a document that actually really isn't from there, it's from somewhere else, but they're saying it's an Essene calendar. So they're trying to re-emphasize this idea that there's an Essene calendar, there's an Essene community rule. They're trying to disassociate Christianity from the Ebion. And that's exactly, I just wanted you to see, it's blatant right there in front of your face. They don't know that it's Essene. Nobody knows it's Essene because there's no evidence there's any Essenes that were ever there, ever, at any time. There's no mention and there's no proof at all. It's complete. It's not even, doesn't even rise to the level of adequate speculation, is what it is. But they're perpetuating it as much as they possibly can. And I particularly like this sensitivity, Baigent. Remember, he's not a Christian. He's just talking as an observer here. He says the Dead Sea Scrolls were not like a modern book expounding a controversial thesis. They would comprise first-hand evidence buttressed by the sturdy struts of 20th century science and scholarship. Even for a non-believer, however, some question of moral responsibility would have arisen. Whatever his own skepticism could be, casually and at a single stroke, you could undermine the faith to which millions clung for solace and consolation. So he's saying this is like, you know, if you're like him, you're not a particular religious person. What if you expose something that now the faith of millions is affected and they would be disappointed? So there's a responsibility that anybody would feel. In these particular documents, they're so close to the heart of Christianity. And then let's listen how he makes a further comment. For Davao, this priest, and his colleagues working as representatives of the Roman Catholic Church, okay, and this is the Dead Sea Scrolls team, It must have seemed as though they were handling the spiritual and religious equivalent of dynamite, something that might just conceivably demolish the entire edifice of Christian teaching or belief. Yes, that's what you would be concerned about, particularly if your church knew that it had suppressed the history of the Ebion for centuries, and you went and persecuted them, and you treated them as heretics, and you burned all their documents, and you made them be taken out of every library, and even the Hebrew Matthew written by the Ebion, you were willing to destroy even the original Matthew manuscript in order to perpetuate certain doctrines and teachings. Yes, that church is going to be very afraid that those works are somehow in this collection. And by this time, they know they are there, and they're not telling anybody. They did not breathe a whisper that the word poor was there and it represented the name of the group. None of that. They didn't say diddly about it. Okay, so that's all he has to say about how much he can connect anything to anything. And so you can see there's not enough there to say much of anything, but he's putting his finger on the button, and it's close enough, and you can see the church, the Catholic Church in particular, the one who destroyed the Ebionite records and had Rufinus go through the Clementine homilies and just take out every reference to Paul that was obviously critical and being attacked by Peter, and put in the name Simon Magus, and everybody knows and agrees that's obviously who Paul was, the obvious target there, and they thought that was clever. Okay, so now we're going to go look at, he puts in his preface what's influencing him to raise these questions, and he's going to say some things about Robert Eisenman. So I like this way of exposing all of you to Robert Eisenman, who he is, his background, and he's the one in one more year is going to reveal to us some of the blockbuster remaining documents that have been hidden away for almost 50 years. So they start in the preface, page IX. We should like to thank Robert Eisenman for the generosity with which he made available to us his time, his energy, and his insights. We are particularly grateful for the light he has cast on the relationship between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament. I'm not going to read this entire paragraph to you, but this is the credentials for Robert Eisenman. I'm going to read some of this to you so you can get the idea that I'm going to highlight the key things about somebody who he had to have the background he did. There was only one person in the world who probably had all these backgrounds. He's amazing he's the only right person in my mind who could have ever put together all these pieces because of his language ability, his personal background, his everything. Is it with this point that we came upon the work of Robert Eisenman, chairman of the Department of Religious Studies and professor of Middle East religions at California State University in Long Beach. He was an undergraduate at Cornell, studied literature in Vladimir Nabokov, BA in physics and philosophy, 1958. That was when I was born. So this guy is pretty old. And his MA, master's, is in Hebrew and Near Eastern Studies from New York University, 1966. In 1971, he got a PhD in Middle East languages. He studied Palestinian history. He was an external fellow at the University of Calabria. He was had some sort of relationship with the Dead Sea Scrolls and Christian origins at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. In 1985-86, he was research fellow in residence at the William F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. I mean, this guy has every credential and the background to read Hebrew and ancient languages and Middle Eastern languages. And he just, any book you read of his is just like an encyclopedia. He has an encyclopedic cross-referencing capability unequaled to anybody you'll ever see in any book. Okay, and they say, we drew extensively on Eisenman's work, this is Baigent and his partner, in the first section of The Messianic Legacy, London, 1986. Our conclusions owed much to the perspective he had opened for us on biblical scholarship and the historical background to the New Testament. However, certain questions remain unanswered. We could not have known it at the time, but we had overlooked a crucial link, a link that has, over the last 5 years, become a focus for controversy, a topic for front-page articles in national newspapers. That link proved to be the information provided by the Dead Sea Scrolls. At the center of the puzzle we were to discover was a hitherto unknown connection between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the elusive figure of St. James, Jesus' brother, whose dispute with Paul precipitated the formulation of the new religion subsequently known as Christianity. It was this link that had been painstakingly concealed by a small enclave of biblical scholars whose conveniently orthodox interpretation of the scrolls Eisenman came to call the consensus. Now I want to say this to you, is he's putting this in his prefix, and most people write their prefix after they're done. So the chapter I read you earlier, it doesn't show his awareness of what is being suppressed is this conflict between James the Just and Paul, and because that's what's going to be revealed, and he's aware of it now as he's writing the prefix, and Eisenman is going to come out very shortly, within 1 year, or in the year 1992. Could be, who knows, maybe a few months or maybe up to 12 months separated, but still he's probably getting the information now from Eisenman. Paul is the centerpiece of these new documents we're going to be revealing in 1992. And what's so interesting is he goes on to say this. It was this link that had been painstakingly concealed by a small enclave of biblical scholars whose conveniently orthodox interpretation of scrolls Eisenman came to call the consensus. According to Robert Eisenman, a small group of specialists largely working together developed a consensus. In lieu of clear historical insight, preconceptions and reconstructions, such as they were stated as facts. And these results, which were used to corroborate each other, in turn became new assumptions that were used to draw away a whole generation of students unwilling or simply unable to question the work of their mentors. What's going on? No different than what's going on for centuries. The truth, the establishment doesn't want the truth to come out about the Ebion in these documents, and they're doing everything they can to basically take the young people's minds and not teach you the truth. Because if you knew the truth will set you free from their tyranny. I guess that rhymes. And that is important because the conflict between James the Just and Paul is a key to understanding what is going on, and the serious problem within Christianity that never got, well, it was fixed then. See, that's the interesting thing. The church had made a decision about Paul, but for some reason, later on in time, Paul was elevated, and Paul was not properly resolved. And that's how he came back in, and Constantine made it worse, and he elevated Paul, as we're documenting in a series that we're doing simultaneously with these kind of episodes. So let me continue here and wrap this up if I can. Okay, so again, this is the preface of Baigent in the Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. He's continuing to explain. The result has been the upholding of an official orthodoxy of interpretation, a framework of assumptions and conclusions which, to outsiders, appears to have the solidity of established and undisputed fact. In this fashion, many of the so-called données, the givens, of history were produced. Those responsible for developing the consensus view of Christianity have been able to exercise a monopoly over certain crucial sources, regulating the flow of information in a manner that enables its release to serve one's own purpose. Basically, manipulation. That you choke the source of the information, and then you dribble it out, and you hold back any information that would be unfavorable to you, and then you let a consensus form around myths and misunderstandings and incomplete conclusions, and you have people perpetuating lies like the Essene theory, the monastery at Qumran, that there is even a community to even consider at Qumran, which is completely non-existent. It was a little fort. That's all the only property being occupied was a small fort, and we now know they were kicked out apparently even a few years before the fall of the temple. So this was basically a vacated area when the people came down from the Library of Jerusalem to put these things inside of the caves. Those responsible for developing the consensus view of Christianity have been able to exercise a monopoly over certain crucial sources, regulating the flow of information in a manner that enables its release to serve one's own purpose. This is the phenomenon explored by Umberto Eco in The Name of the Rose, where the monastery and the library within it reflect the medieval church's monopoly of learning, constituting a kind of closed shop, an exclusive country club of knowledge from which All but a select few are banned. A select few prepare to toe the party line. Yeah, so the reason the people got allowed to be scholars to look at the Dead Sea Scroll wasn't because they were the best scholars. It's because they were the scholars who would toe the party line. That's at least what he is suggesting is what has really gone on. And that explains why there's been so much suppression going on. His preface continues, XIX, that's 19. To challenge those interpretations is to find oneself labeled at best a crank, at worst a renegade, apostate, or heretic. And I just did a video today about what is the way to shepherd people back and keep into orthodoxy is you use fear, you use labels that make it sound like you're crazy, that you're an extremist, or you're somehow unorthodox when you're just saying, hey, the evidence points to the Ebion being our original church, so let's talk about that. So he goes on. Few scholars have the combination of courage, standing, and expertise to issue such a challenge and hold onto their reputations. Robert Eisenman, whose currency and credibility have placed him among the most prominent and influential figures in his field, has done so. His story provided the impetus for this book. And again, I want to reiterate, one day humanity, not just one country, not one people, will thank Robert Eisenman for the discoveries he made and brought forth, and we would not have had the Dead Sea Scrolls but for him. I should say we would not have had unfettered access from objective historians like himself but for Robert Eisenman. Okay, so now I want to squeeze this in. We've been going 34 minutes. I hope you can just bear with me for, I think, maybe 6 or 7 more minutes. You're now going to hear what came out in 1992 in a summary form. So I found an article by Robert Price reviewing the Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered. That's a 1992 book by Robert Eisenman and Michael Wise, and they had left to reveal their 50, Eisenman is the one who got hold of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he's releasing at this time in this translation of 92, 50 more works, and you're going to hear some highlights about it, and they're very remarkable, particularly about the issue of Paul. Readers of this long-awaited collection of the sequestered remainder of the Qumran scrolls, now they're calling it sequestered because it's been held captive by basically the Catholic authorities, or people operating pursuant to Catholic interests. Readers of this long-awaited collection of the sequestered remainder of the Qumran scrolls will naturally be forced to ask themselves, was it worth the wait? Since the wait was totally unnecessary to begin with, probably not. Indeed, one cannot help but wonder why the scholarly cabal of the international team possibly imagined that fragments like these required their dilatory attentions, and no one else's for all those decades. This collection of 50 documents represents what the editors judged to be the most interesting and important of the scrolls hidden away by the Qumran Brotherhood of Strugnell, Devout, that's the priest, Benoit, Milik, and the rest. Those are the guys who all teamed up to not give us the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm joking. I mean, they gave us parts and dribbled, but not the ones that are of most interest to Christianity, to Christians, the ones dealing with the Ebion. And yet there is little merit to the preceding hype, at least nothing obvious to the unaided eye. And that is where the scholarly aid of editors Eisenman and Wise proves so vital. The scroll snippets contained here, and snippets is what most of them are, and I'm going to jump it there, assume the real significance only once they are read in the framework of the paradigm supplied in Eisenman's earlier books, Maccabees, Zaddikites, Christians, and Qumran, and then a book called James the Just in the Habakkuk Pesher. Eisenman argues, marshalling a vast amount of eye-popping esoterica from neglected sources, that the Qumran scrolls represent not a monastery of Essenes as conventionally defined, and so on and so forth. And let me jump to the next slide. If both what we have conventionally dubbed Essenes and Zealots are included in this movement, so were the Nazarenes, Ebionites, or Jewish Christians. As Eisenman reads them, Paul himself figures quite prominently in the scrolls as the man of the lie, or the spouter of lies, or the scoffer, who repudiated the Torah in the midst of the congregation, becoming the enemy by making himself the friend of men, pursuing smooth things rather than the rigor of the law. A lot's in there. And Robert Rice's review continues. His opposite number, the teacher of righteousness, is to be identified as James the Zaddik. Zaddik means righteous one. And then Price puts down James the Just. That's another way of saying it. The number of striking correspondences between the portrait of James in the New Testament and other sources on the one hand and that of the teacher in the scrolls on the other is very impressive. As scroll scholars have long recognized in the Qumran materials, we must be dealing with a major Jewish movement of the day. The only question was, which one? Why not the Jewish Christians? And Robert Price is going to just make a mention here of something that's very significant to have changed the ability to have these kind of discussions. He says, what Eisenman sees had been invisible until now because of the consensus dating of the scrolls a century or two too early. So the original dates were fixed way longer and way further in the past, but not based on accurate assessments. Let's just put it that way. So let's assume they were honestly done, but they were wrong. And so these scrolls did not date as far back as they claimed, and therefore they fit in the range of right up to even the time of the temple, 70 AD. It could be anywhere in this range, but there are certain documents that could be identified closer to 150 to 100 AD BC. And so, there's different dates for different things. And then why Price in his review says a good handful of new fragments and texts are particularly suggestive. So this is the new stuff that's being added to 50 more documents. Once one puts on the new spectacles, so you can see things differently. And Eisenman has prescribed us to look at 4Q525, entitled The Demons of Death. It contains in its brief compass a surprising number of parallels with the New Testament Epistle of James. Both stress God's willingness to grant wisdom to the asker. Both warn against slander with the tongue. Both link wisdom with the law in the manner of Baruch, 3 verse 9. Both warn of the futility of seeking anything from God without singleness of heart. Both advise their readers to accept adversities as divine chastisements. Both compare sin to poison. Other parallels appear here and there in the text, especially in the 2 letters on works righteousness, which, by the way, Eisenman later changed the names of these. I don't know if he was doing it still this way. He called it Justification by Faith. Whereas in the Habakkuk Pesher, we have very Jamesian sentiments in the question of whether works are needed to complement saving faith. So definitely in Habakkuk, the dispute was over the Habakkuk Pesher of the Ebion, the Dead Sea Scrolls, was that the Spouter of Lies contended that Habakkuk 2 verse 4 meant salvation by faith, and the Zaddik, the just one, he contended, and the group contended that it meant faithfulness because that's what emunah means, obedience or strength. What do you call it? Basically, when you hold your hands up, is steadfastness. There you go. Okay. The second of these letters, incidentally, would seem to threaten to overthrow Lloyd Gaston's contention in his Paul and the Torah that we nowhere find the phrase works of the law, meaning works that the law requires. So this is not without significance, that some people were trying to claim, well, Paul isn't really putting down works for that the law requires when he speaks about works. It means works in a more amorphic sense, and so he's not condemning the obedience to the law. And so one of the proofs by Gaston was that there is no explanation of what works of the law mean in Paul's writings. But we see when you look in the works righteousness 2 documents, you see it's definitely being used, and the works of the law do mean works that the law requires. And I think this is very interesting. Among those 50 documents, Eisenman and Wise argue that the writers of the scrolls, whoever they were, seem to have believed in a single Davidic Messiah, who may nonetheless have had Levite lineage as well. So that's always interesting, because in the real Jesus, he should have Joseph as a father, and he would have his mother as Mary. Joseph was the one of the Davidic line according to Matthew and Luke, and the Levite line would be Mary, because her relative Elizabeth was marrying a Levite, and Levites could only marry Levitical women. women from the Levitical tribe. So she's definitely from the Levite tribe because of that relationship. Okay, anyway, so that's just an interesting aspect of what's in these scrolls. I'm not going to read all this in the interest of keeping this short, but there's another document they brought out for the first time, 4Q541, A Firm Foundation, and it's very similar between Matthew 13, verse 11 through 17. But what I actually think is what's amazing, because of the words parable used twice. Now I am proclaiming to you a parable, and then later it says I'm speaking a parable. So even though it's it's remarkable to be a parallel to Matthew 13, verse 11 to 17, but it's actually pretty unusual to see in any of these kind of writings it says, I'm going to tell you a parable. And that's one of Jesus' most characteristic ways of talking to people. And now what was also pretty remarkable is that document we're looking at could literally be before, well, in an account or a gospel before telling the story of Jesus, because it has later down the same page that document offers a prediction of one who, quote, will make atonement for all the children of his generation. He will be sent to all the sons of his generation. Wow. So now these Robert Price is making a comment that something else will be said, and then this will be he'll interpret it. So there's one more aspect of this document. It says they will invent stories about him, they will say shameful things about him. So then he's speculating that means that's a prophecy that could apply to Jesus if the Jewish people said negative things about him, and they do that in the Talmudic materials. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that. So that's a very unusual statement to find anywhere except Isaiah 53. All right, so we've come to the end of our episode, and basically what happens at the end is Eisenman in 1992 edit, translate, and publish all the remaining scrolls that are significant with blinding speed, and they basically, as Robert Price says, they could be commended because using the words of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they acted as discerning interpreters of wonderful mysteries. So, okay, I hope this helped everybody to understand better the progress of the Dead Sea Scrolls from this suppressed work for 40 years to a work that had now the hope that the truth would come out. And it's been 30 years later, and it's come out. It just has not been given any attention by the mainstream, and that's the problem. So mainstream thought has confluence with Christianity and Christianity and Catholicism, Protestantism and Catholicism. They can influence the narrative because the narrative is not expanded. And so basically we need to get this out in the open. We need to tell people, hey, there is something of significance. The Ebionites are front and center, and this conflict with Paul is front and center in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is something that was destroyed by the people who succeeded later in time, primarily the Constantine Church. They destroyed all of this memory because they wanted Paul to look really great and a major figure, so he could end Sabbath and Constantine could get people to worship on his day of the sun. So it basically fits a narrative when you look at all the facts that this was deliberately suppressed, not just in the Dead Sea Scrolls investigation, but the Catholic Church did this a long time ago, back in the 300s under Constantine, destroyed all the records of the Ebion, and they knew that, and they have a conscious awareness and memory of what they've done, and that's why they had to step in here and try to stop it from getting out. Okay, everybody, I hope that helped. God bless. Take care. Ciao.